Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about academic writing and more specifically what APA and plagiarism is. The APA is going to be based off of APA 7th edition. So what is academic writing? Academic writing is a skill that is used to facilitate communication and convey thoughts and ideas in a way that demonstrates understanding, respect, education, and effectiveness. We use academic writing within the education setting when drafting emails, submitting assignments, papers, presentations, or any documentation in the hospital. Examples of professional and academic writing means that it is clear and concise, easy to read, said in a respectful tone, uses proper titles and credentials when addressing someone, follows proper grammar and citations when necessary, has consistent font and color, and is objective and free of all judgment. I specifically want to make a note about the consistent font and color because as a professor, I see this quite a bit where students will submit an assignment or a paper that has part of the assignment that's using Arial text and then part Times New Roman. It could be that some of the font is gray, some is black. And what that tells us as professors is that something was copy and pasted. And when we get to talking about plagiarism, we'll talk a little bit about how copy and pasting often indicates that there's some plagiarism going on. So keep that in mind when you're drafting academic writing. Some examples of non-professional or non-academic writing involves the use of slang words, improper use of titles and credentials, lack of sentence structure or proper grammar, being repetitive, accusatory, or vague. So when talking about emails specifically, we're going to break down a situation and talk about what academic writing would be and unacademic writing. So the situation is that the student submitted an assignment 2 weeks ago and still hasn't been graded. The student would like feedback on the assignment in preparation for future activities. So a professional or academic way to address this would be to email the professor saying, "Hello, Professor Smith," so we're using the proper title. "I am reaching out to inquire about ATI assignment, ATI fundamentals from Module 2. I was wondering when I can expect feedback on the assignment as I would like to know how I can improve the ATI assignment in Module 4. Thank you so much for all that you do," and then their name. So you can see here, like I mentioned, that they're using the proper title. It's non-accusatory, it's very specific, so we know exactly what assignment that the student is referring to. And it's not repetitive, it's still very respectful. So an unacademic writing would be saying, "Hi, Jim," so hi would be the slang word. "When are you going to grade my assignment? It's been 2 weeks and that should have been graded by now. It's not fair to me if I get marked down points on the next assignment if I don't know what I did wrong." So a couple of issues here. Like I said, we have some use of slang. It's very accusatory. It's not very specific. And it has no ending with the student's name or anything. So keep in mind when you're drafting emails that it should be very professional. You should be addressing your professors by their proper title. You should be clear, concise, and productive in the email. There should not be any smiley faces, emojis. Like I said, no slang words. Make sure that you're using grammar. I get many emails that don't have proper punctuation, and that makes it really difficult to read. So next I want to talk about discussion boards. So a discussion board is ultimately created to facilitate discussion. So when you are drafting your post on a discussion board, you should make sure that it's addressing the prompt, but it's also doing it in a way that facilitates discussion, especially when you're responding to your peers. When you respond to your peers, you shouldn't just say something like, "I agree with you, you wrote that great." You should be saying something that either elaborates why you agree with that person or maybe why you may disagree. It should, whether you agree or disagree, offer scholarly evidence behind why you feel the way that you feel. It should pose new ideas. And ultimately, like I said, it should be conversational. So the situation here is that a student is responding to a peer's initial post about how they agree with what that student said about diabetes. And I just want to be clear, everything that I'm saying in this post um, is not necessarily accurate. I have a citation here. I made that up. It's not a real article or anything, but this is just an example to see how you would format it academically. So the proper way that you would address this would be something along the lines of, "Hello, Sarah. I agree with your take on how individuals with diabetes are more likely to have comorbid complications such as foot ulcers. According to Pierce 2015, the way that the sugar moves through the blood can be damaging to vessels and nerves and can impair healing. I do hypothesize that if an individual can demonstrate better blood sugar control, they would reduce the risk of these comorbidities." So you can see here, it's professionally written, it's using the student's proper title, it's got proper grammar, proper citations, um, it's offering why they agree, but also furthering discussion by offering something else to talk about and to discuss. And the improper way to do it would be, "Hi, Sarah, smiley face. I agree completely. The way that you wrote that was good, and I like what you said." So, a couple of issues here. Like I said, we shouldn't just agree and comment on their writing, we should be conversing with them. It also has a smiley face, it uses some slang, and it's really non-scholarly and non-productive. So now on to documentation. So this would be an example of scholarly and academic writing, or I'm sorry, professional or academic writing when documenting in the hospital setting. So you would do this at clinicals. This particular situation is based more on an anecdotal note, which means that you can actually create a narrative and chart that versus clicking on different boxes. Um, so the situation would be, you are documenting a situation in which the patient became upset and started swearing at staff. So the academic or professional way to write this would be, at 09:15, the patient approached staff tearful and expressing anger. Staff inquired into why the patient felt this way, to which the patient responded, "F you, get the H away from me, you S nurse." Staff removed themselves from the patient's room until the patient was calm and was able to express their emotions in a constructive manner. So, a couple of things to pay attention to. One, the time is using military time because that's what we use in the healthcare field. It's very specific about what's going on. It specifically quotes the patient so we know exactly what the patient said without offering any interpretation. So our documentation needs to be specific in describing the situation, but should not include any judgment on our part. It should be the information about what happened and how it was handled. So you can see here there's some good background information, and then we have exactly what the patient said and then what the staff did to address that. So, an unacademic or unprofessional way to document this would be saying something along the lines of, "This morning, the patient was mad and upset and started to be mean to staff. They were swearing a lot, and it seemed like the patient was being unfair. I left the room until the patient was able to control themselves better." So, a couple of things that's wrong with this. It's not very specific. It may be totally accurate, but it's not written in a way that's free of judgment and free of interpretation. Um, they're calling the patient out for being unfair, for not being able to control themselves. That's very judgmental language. So this would be unprofessional or unacademic writing. Now on to assignments, presentations, papers, more specifically, what APA and plagiarism is. So we will start off with plagiarism because this is a very, very, very important issue and concept within education. Depending on the school you go to's policy, it could actually result in removal from your program, removal from the university, and it's a very serious matter. So, what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is the intentional or unintentional use of someone else's work without properly giving them credit through either citations or gaining their permission for use. So, a couple of things I want to point out with this: intentional or unintentional. I get a lot of students that say, "Well, I didn't know I was plagiarizing." That doesn't matter, it's still plagiarized. So, you don't always have to mean to plagiarize. Sometimes it is something that just happens accidentally. And a lot of times when it is accidental plagiarism, it's because it wasn't cited properly using proper in-text citations or proper references. Another thing is, especially when using images, people don't always realize that you may have to get permission to put that image on a presentation or to use a certain scale in your study. So some tips on avoiding plagiarism. Make sure that you always put things in your own words. So after you've gathered the information from the source, how would you explain that to someone, and write it in your own way? If you can't put it in your own words, make sure that you use properly formatted quotations. And we'll talk about quotations a little bit, and I'll give examples of the two ways to format those. You should be citing any information that you use from another source by adding a reference to the reference page and also using in-text citations. And I'll also show an example of that. You should cite all pictures or images that are used in a presentation, especially if they're not specifically labeled to be free and able to use for access. Also, remember that you can plagiarize yourself. So if you've published a paper in the past or you've used an assignment for another course and you resubmit either that full assignment or pieces of the assignment, or if you try to use one of your previous articles in a future article, that is still plagiarizing. You do have to give yourself credit for the work that you've already done. Another tip is to use some type of plagiarism checker. I think the most commonly used one is Turnitin, and that gives you a match of how much your assignment or your paper matches either a website, another paper, a scholarly source, and it gives you a good indication of any spots where there may be plagiarism. Typically, we recommend that when utilizing Turnitin, you should aim for a 10% match or less. It's unlikely that you're going to get 0% if you've used things like quotations, because even though a quotation may be properly cited, it will still match on a plagiarism checker. So then that helps you to identify, hey, this matches somewhere else. So you know to make sure that you properly quoted it and that you properly cited it. So some plagiarism practice. I have 3 examples here using in-text citations, and we'll get to talking about this a little bit so it makes a little bit more sense, but there's 2 that are properly cited and 1 that's improperly cited. So the example or the sentence would be, people with diabetes report liking ice cream more than people without diabetes. In quotations, the website that this fake sentence would have come from. Then we have, people with diabetes report liking ice cream more than people without diabetes, in parentheses, the author's last name and the year the article was published. Then according to Jones, in parentheses, the year the article was published, individuals with diabetes tend to enjoy foods with high sugar content, such as ice cream. So here we have 3 different sentences, very, very similar. The proper way to use in-text citations is to do the author and then the year, whether it be in parentheses at the end of the sentence or like the bottom one where you have according to the author in parentheses the year. The top one would be plagiarism because it's improperly cited. We don't cite by giving, or we don't use an in-text citation by giving the web address. So now on to APA. What is APA? So it's a process of citation and formatting that's used in the medical setting. It is set forth by the American Psychiatric Association, and it's the universal form of communication for scientific writing and research worldwide. So if you are working on an assignment or a paper in another country, you're likely going to be using APA formatting. It is a necessary skill for nursing education, and it's a way to show evidence of professionalism in your education and communication. So APA basics. There's 4 different aspects to an APA paper or an assignment. There's the cover page, the abstract, the text or the body, and the reference page. You may not be required to submit an abstract depending on what the assignment is and what your professor is requesting. I'll show an example of what that cover page, an abstract, a text, and a reference page looks like. It should be double spaced. Fonts that are accepted based on APA 7th edition is Calibri 11-point font, Arial 11-point font, Lucida Sans Unicode 10-point font, Times New Roman 12-point font, Georgia 11-point font, and Computer Modern 10-point font. Your paper should have a 1-inch border on the right and left side. It should be black font. You should use proper headings and page numbers, and we avoid the use of first person. First person is saying things like I. Depending on the media in which you're using APA, there may be situations where using first person is acceptable. For example, if you're giving a presentation, it is okay to say I. If you're writing a paper, you would avoid that by saying something along the lines of this author believes. So when we talk about headings, there's a bunch of different levels for that. And headings are really important because they help to organize a paper and they help to let everyone know what they're going to be reading in that context. There can be overreaching subjects and then sub-subjects that's identified by these different levels of headings. So the overreaching or main concepts are going to be centered, bold, and title case. Title case means upper and lowercase level letters. Then if you have something specific that you want to talk about within that category, it would be a left-aligned, bold title case heading. So for example, if I'm talking about cardiac heart failure, my main centered level 1 headings may be something along the lines of the assessment, common nursing problems, common nursing goals, common interventions, and nursing education. But maybe within assessment, I want to talk about more specifically. So then I'm going to go to level 2, and my level 2 headings may be how it affects the cardiac system, how it affects the respiratory system. Maybe within that, I even want to break it down further and talk about subjective and objective data. So then that would lead me to my level 3 heading, and that would be a left-aligned, bold, italicized title case heading. And I will show you when I kind of go through the sample paper what those different headings look like. So now on to APA numbering and abbreviation. When we are using numbers, any whole number less than 10 is spelled out. So if you are saying 5, it would be F-I-V-E instead of the number. Anything greater than 10 is used as a number. And anything that describes a date, a time, an age, a response to a scale, money, ratios, decimals, percentages are going to use numbers. We try to use words rather than symbols whenever possible, but we can use symbols like if it's a specific symbol that is very commonly used and accepted in medical writing. When using decimals with APA formatting, we always go to 1 decimal point unless we're talking about p-values, which we would use the specific p-value, or when we're talking about standard deviations, that would be 2 decimal points. The only time we use Roman numerals, not Rome, but Roman numerals is when it's part of the terminology. So for example, type 1 error, type 2 diabetes, that's when we would use Roman numerals. When using abbreviations, we only use an abbreviation if it's a medically accepted abbreviation or when that abbreviation doesn't interfere with understanding of the concept. This is especially important because people might not all have the same understanding of the abbreviation. A really great example is, I would say that the abbreviation MS means multiple sclerosis. However, sometimes I see it charted that patient had a different MS or admitting diagnosis, MS, and it means mental status to that person. So when I look at that, I see a change in musculosclerosis. So It's really important not to use abbreviations unless it's something that is very standard. So an example of something that's very standard would be something like liters or milliliters using an uppercase L or a lowercase ml. If we do use an abbreviation, we should spell out the word first and then in parentheses have that abbreviation. So for example, if I were writing about the American Nurses Association, the first time that I use ANA, which is the abbreviation for American Nurses Association, I'm gonna spell it out in parentheses, put ANA, and then when I refer to the American Nurses Association further in my assignment or my paper, I can just put ANA. So some resources to help with professional writing is using some type of plagiarism checker. Like I said, Turnitin is the one that I'm familiar with. I'm sure that there's a lot more out there. Reach out to your faculty, see if you're on the right page for what their expectations are. Most places have a writing center or writing tutoring that you can utilize. And for APA help specifically, you can purchase the APA manual, and also Purdue OWL from Purdue University has a lot of different writing guides that define the different rules for different types of formatting and citation. And they have a really good breakdown of how to do different things like in-text citations with different authors, how to do different references in your reference page, how to do different headings and levels and things like that. So it's a really good resource to look specifically if you are stuck on a particular point of the formatting. So now onto the sample paper. I'm going to share a paper and kind of talk about what your cover page should look like, what your abstract should look like. I'll talk about the body and show examples of quotations, citations, the different headings, and then we'll talk about the reference page. All right, so this is a paper that I wrote for my doctorate, and this here is your cover page. So on the cover page, you're going to have the number in the upper right corner. In the past, we have required a heading on the cover page that said running head with a lowercase h and then a colon and then in all bold letters the title of the paper. With APA 7th edition, they've taken away that running head for student papers. If you're publishing a paper, you would still include that. But you still want to have the page number in the upper right corner, then the title of your paper, your name, whatever course you're writing the paper for that may be optional depending on the assignment and what your professor's looking for. And then another optional piece would possibly be the assignment title. So after the cover page, you would have the abstract, which I'll actually show on a different document. And then after the abstract, you have your body. So in the body, you're going to have your heading, which is going to be the title of the paper in all caps. You're going to have your page number again in that upper right corner. You're going to have the title of the paper again, and then the text. So you can see here I have a couple of in-text citations. That means that the information that I'm providing here is in my own words, but I still got that information from a source. So when we're doing in-text citations, you do the author's last names, comma, the year. This particular article had 2 different authors, so I included both of them. Same thing with this one, but this information I actually saw in 2 different sources. So I'm going to give 2 authors credit for this information. So I have the first source and then a semicolon in the second source. Here is an example of where we give the author's last names in parentheses, the year embedded within the sentence. So because I did that, I'm not going to have the parentheses with the author, comma, year at the end here. You can see that this particular source had multiple authors. So I am going to list them all because it's less than 5 or less than 6. And with APA, if there's more authors than that, then what we'll do is we'll list the first 4 or 5, ... then the last author in parentheses, the year. So now I'm going to go ahead and share the other document so I can show you the abstract. So this is the same paper, but just a little bit of different formatting. So I didn't want to confuse anyone, but here would be your abstract. So an abstract is very, very brief, and it's basically a summary of what your article is going to be talking about. You can also include keywords for what your article is about specifically as well. So moving back down to the actual text, I want to show you some examples of quotations. So there's two ways to do quotations. There is the kind of common just in quotes, which I think is coming up soon. Sorry, it's taken me a minute to find it. Okay, so here I'm going to state who said it. So I'm giving them credit. Here's the author in parentheses, the year. And then I'm using their specific wording. So I am putting it in quotations. I'm also going to either put in parentheses at the end the page number where that was found from, or if it's on a web page and there aren't page numbers, the paragraph that it was found in. Now, if your quotation, so this quotation takes up part of one line and then a whole second line. So this would be considered a 2-line quotation. If the quotation is more than 4 lines, then we use a block quotation. So to show you an example of the block quotation, we're going to scroll up a little bit. And here's a block quotation. So when we use a block quotation with APA formatting, the whole quotation is indented. So you can see here, it's all level and it's all indented from the main text. We're not going to use the quotation marks, but we are still going to introduce it by citing the source, offering the year, and the paragraph or the page number. So now on to the different headings. So you can see here, my overreaching concept of this chapter is patient to nurse sexual harassment. But then I'm going to break that down to the definition. So I have my second level heading here. Then I'm going to talk about the history. So this is again a second level because I didn't have any subcategories in the definition. That was the only thing I wanted to talk about in that section. Then the current status, what's going on with sexual harassment in the workplace. Then review of the literature, same thing. I'm going to talk about the prevalence. And then here, so under the prevalence, I want to talk about how we kind of have an understanding of what sexual harassment is and how often it happens towards nurses, but we also know it's underreported. So this is, again, a subcategory under a different category. So this is going to be a third level heading. So you can kind of see how breaking down the paper based on those different headings is going to be helpful in organizing the paper and understanding how that's formatted. So the last thing I want to talk about is the reference page. Sorry, that's my appendices. So going up to the reference page. When we have our references, they should be in alphabetical order. They should all be consistent font with the rest of the paper and double spaced. You're going to have references in bold at the top and then start listing your sources that you used for the paper. Depending on what source you used is going to determine how that's formatted. If you cite an article, that's going to be different than how you cite a book or a chapter. You are going to oftentimes, and you can refer to a manual to clarify this in how you would format it for different sources, but you would have the author, the year, and then the title. And like I said, depending on where you get it, each of these are going to look a little bit different. So here you can see I'm citing a specific organization. So that's going to look a lot different than if I'm citing an article. So here's an example of an article. We have multiple authors here listed, the year that the article was published, the title of the article. And I just want to point out that in the title, only the first word is capitalized. Then in the italices, I have the journal that it's from. I have the issue, the page number, and then the DOI. You can offer either the DOI or the web page that you retrieved it from. However, the DOI is going to be more specific and a better, we would use that first above the web page. If we do use the web page, we want to write retrieved from and then the web page. So like I said, for specific how to format different things, utilize Purdue OWL, utilize the APA manual, because it is going to differ based on the sources. I see a lot of times that students will use a citation generator. That can be a helpful tool if you properly put in the right information. But if you don't necessarily put in the information correctly, then your citation is not going to be accurate. So I always recommend to actually do your references on your own without using one of those citation checkers, because a lot of times they will be inaccurate. And that wraps up our discussion on academic writing. And I hope that you all learned something.